Hello everyone, and yes, welcome back to the good stuff. It's a 1921 World Chess Championship match between Jose Raul Capablanca and Emanuel Lasker. We already seen 4 games. All 4 were ended in a draw, and here we have game 5, which might also have ended in a draw, but it could also be a very crazy game with a decisive result. There's no way to tell unless we watch the video. So without further ado, let's just check it out. Capablanca, for the 3rd time with the white pieces, now opens with the d4. The first time he opened with d4, then he tried e4, and we had a nice Ruy Lopez. Now again he goes for d4. Lasker continues with d5. We have knight to f3, knight to f6, and now c4, and of course e6, and the queen's gambit declined is on the board. Bishop to g5. Capablanca doesn't like to close his bishop in with e3 before developing it. We have knight bd7, and only now e3. With bishop to e7 by Lasker, knight to c3, and Lasker castles to safety. We have rook to c1 by Capablanca, b6, and now c captures on d5. E captures on d5 and queen to a4. And here c5, and this is where the game basically starts. Capablanca says that up until this point, c5 was considered to be the strongest move here. And Capablanca agrees that the c5 is the strongest move here, but he said that here he had an inspiration, and then that he found the only idea that basically challenges this c5 move. And here he played queen to c6. Now, what's the plan here? Obviously, if this was good, people would have spotted it before. Now, the rook is under attack, so what do you do here? Lasker played rook to b8. Of course, you have to get the rook out of harm's way. And now you have to decide what's next. Bishop to f4 looks like an excellent move. You're attacking the rook here. The rook doesn't really have a good square to go to, and but the problem is you can go bishop to b7, and now queen to a4. Yes, your rook is still under attack, and now you can either move the rook to a8, which defends the a7 pawn, but you can also go rook to c8, and this is why black says, yeah, sure, grab my pawn, I'm gonna grab some activity. Now, you cannot trap the queen here because the bishop is hanging, so first bishop to c6, and now how do you get the queen back into the game? If black is allowed to push c4 and lock the light square bishop out of the game, it's going to be very good for black. So here bishop to b5, but now rook to a8, queen to c7, and only now bishop captures on b5. And after knight captures, you will now eliminate the a2 pawn, so you win your pawn back and you have a much better position. For example, if we get a queen trade over here, rook captures and you have to defend the pawn, rook b1, then you get c4, and at one point black will kick away this knight, start pushing b5, b4, c3, maybe create a passed pawn on the queen side, and black will have a very nice game. So this is definitely not what Capablanca had in mind. What's the idea behind queen to c6? Well, here Capablanca played knight captures on d5. And okay, Lasker continues in the same fashion. Bishop to b7, first tries to kick away the queen, and then if this is possible, white loses a piece. So knight captures on e7 with check, queen captures on e7, and now you have to get the queen out of the way, queen to a4. So what's to be played here? Rook b to c8 by Lasker. Now, how do you continue here with white? You already grabbed a pawn. Can you grab another? For example, queen captures on a7. The question is no, because here after you capture on d4, the queen and the king are on the same file, so you will not be able to recapture. And even if rook captures on c8 first, then queen to b4 check, white loses castling privileges, king d1, and now you'll capture with the bishop, so the bishop on b7 doesn't remain a target, everything is nicely defended, and black just has a better position. So, after rook b to c8, Capablanca says this is the position he had in mind when he decided to go for this queen to c6 idea, queen to a3. And now he says that now we're ready to develop our light square bishop, which goes to a6. Capablanca wants to dominate the queen side, then he castles to safety, and black is unable to untangle here because the queen on e7 is undefended. So this is the pin we're talking about. Here, Lasker unpins with queen to e6, and now you can't go bishop to a6 immediately, because first Capablanca says you need to capture on f6. If you play bishop to a6 right away, then black can go captures on d4. There's still this tension going on here. If you capture, rook captures here, you will have to castle king side, but then again you will be able to now capture on f3 and perhaps give up the exchange. But all in all, you don't really get all that much. So after queen to e6, first the bishop captures. Now the queen has to move away. You cannot capture with the knight, as the knight has to keep an eye on the c5 pawn. So queen captures on f6, and only now bishop to a6. And here, this is move 16 by Capablanca. You all know the time control in this match is 15 moves per hour. So here Lasker took more than half an hour for his next move, which is pretty crazy because you have to play 15 moves an hour. So taking more than half an hour for one move means that you are left with less than half an hour for your next 14 moves. But it is a big decision. Here, if you don't do something, you're just worse. For example, if you play something like this, bishop captures, queen captures, you're gonna have a lot of problems on the queen side. That bishop on b7 really was a monster bishop. For example, if rook c7 defending the pawn, you just castle. And now rook f to c8. Yes, you have nicely doubled your rooks on the c file, but rook f d1, and you don't have good way of reacting to this tension in the center. You will never be able to capture here because of this queen captures on c8 with check. Rook captures, you just give up 2 rooks for a queen, and after knight here, knight captures on d4, and this is just a dominant position for white. Yes, you are only up 1 pawn, but you have 2 rooks for the queen, and black will not be able to do anything pretty much here. It will be a slow and painful death for black. So after bishop to a6, Lasker decides to give up the exchange. Bishop captures on f3. He gives up the exchange here on c8. And Capablanca says that this is the absolute best way to play this with black. And if an ordinary mortal was playing this position, he might have gone for something different. But Lasker knows his stuff, and he decides, activity above all. So Capablanca accepts the challenge with bishop captures on c8, rook captures on c8, and now g captures on f3. Queen captures on f3 by Lasker, now attacking the rook on h1, rook to g1, getting the rook out of the way, also pressuring the g pawn here. And now rook to e8. Already asking Capablanca, are you maybe up for a draw? If maybe Capablanca captures on a7, then Lasker can sacrifice on e3. And after captures, you will play king d1. And now you can either play a series of checks, queen d3 check, queen e3 check, queen f3 check, back and forth with a draw. Or you can capture on g1 with check, deliver another check, maybe get the knight back to safety, create some squares for the king, and then you will be fine. Not right away. I accidentally played that move. So after rook to e8, Capablanca plays queen to d3. A nice centralizing move with the queen, keeping an eye on the d4 pawn. Also maybe preparing queen to d1 or queen to e2 to maybe offer a queen trade. Here g6 by Lasker, and now there are 2 ways to go about it. You can either unpin, for example, go king f1, or try rook g3. For example, queen h1 check, queen to f1. But then the queen just retreats, queen to e4. Again, you're threatening to capture here, and the white queen is somewhat misplaced. So after g6, we have king to f1 by Capablanca, and now rook to e4 with the pretty simple threat. C captures on d4 is the threat, as the queen is undefended here. And here we have queen to d1. Now, as the king is no longer on e1, black doesn't have any tricks, so rook captures on e3. Capablanca offers a queen trade. Of course, Lasker declines. Queen h3 check. We have rook to g2. Now defending the h2 pawn, and knight to f6. Now Lasker wants to get this knight over to h5, capture on d4, and then bring the knight over to f4 to create some threats against the rook on g2. So king to g1, again Capablanca unpins, and c captures on d4. And here, what do you play here? Here Capablanca says that if you just continue captures here, then knight to h5 really is a problem. Because you have to prevent knight to f4. If you don't, it's just game over for white. So you're probably going to go queen c2, attack the rook, queen to f3. And then what do you play? Again, you have to stop knight f4. You have to play queen d1, offer a queen trade. Black will just repeat queen to h3, queen to c2, and we have a draw by repetition, for example. So after c captures on d4, this is the move Capablanca had in mind, and he says, if I didn't have this, I don't know what else to play. Rook to c4. Now he's asking, what do you play here? Lasker, of course, captures on e3, but here's the deal. Capablanca now captures on e4, and it's actually not great to capture on f2. It seems like such a nice in-between move. You might be thinking, okay, it's Zwischenzug time, but it's really not. For example, if you capture here, then you free the rook to control the f-file. Rook captures on f2, and only now, if you recapture, Queen d8 check, king g7, and now queen to d4 check, checks the king, wins the knight. If you didn't capture on f2, the rook would still be on g2, and you would have knight back to f6. This is the idea. So here, Lasker doesn't have a way to further improve, he just has to capture the rook. We have knight captures rook, and now comes queen to d8 check, king to d7, and now queen to d4 check. And now Capablanca is able to force the knight back. Knight to f6 now is possible, of course, and only now f captures on e3. Capablanca is down only one pawn, but he's up the exchange, and he's ready to play rook to f2 to put some pressure on the knight on f6. Queen to e6 by Lasker. It's time to, pull back, as you are no longer attacking, now you are defending. Rook to f2, and now you constantly have to keep your queen and king here, otherwise you're just gonna lose material. Lasker plays g5, he wants to get his king over to g6 to unpin. We have h4 by Capablanca, and this is now move 31, so another set of 15 moves has been played. Now you have more time, an additional hour for the next 15 moves. And here we have g captures on h4 by Lasker. This is the move that was sealed, so here the game was adjourned and continued later. Capablanca says that probably better was king g6, and then if h captures on g5, knight e4. Now you're threatening queen to g4 check, and then you will be able to harass the white king, and the queen is no longer controlling the squares here. So after queen d3, pinning the knight, queen g4 check, you're gonna go king to g2, rook to g2, but now queen to f3, and it's hard to say who's better here or who's worse. Lasker did not play king to g6. He said, nope, g captures on h4 is better. We have queen captures on h4 by Capablanca, and now knight to g4, which is not a problem. The knight is actually a beautiful piece here. Capablanca doesn't have an f pawn or an h pawn to harass the knight, so you will just play something like f5 or h5, and the knight will be a monster knight on g4 basically. So what do you do here? If you try something like rook g2, which seems like something you want to do, you lose the e3 pawn. Queen captures on e3, and now what do you play? King f1, you're going to go get h5, and the knight is just beautiful there. You cannot capture on h5 because you get queen to f3 check, and now you either move from the rook and lose the rook, or you go king to g1, and then queen d1 is just mate in 1. So whatever you do doesn't work here. So after knight g4, Capablanca plays queen to g5 check, and now king to f8. And here Capablanca played rook to f5. Later after the game, Capablanca mentioned that rook to d2 was probably better because rook to d8 is such a terrible threat. There's really not much to do here. You will have to play f6 as the knight guards the f6 square. It's okay, but then after queen to f4, what do you play? For example, you either play h5, and then after h5, queen to d6 trades queens, which is favorable for white. And if you don't play h5, you play something like king to f7. Then again, just rook to d6, attack the queen, and after queen to c8, now you play e4, and your position is just great. And black's pieces aren't doing all that much. Now, the queen has to keep an eye on the knight here, which is a pretty passive thing to do. You can't really deliver any checks. Well, you can deliver queen c5 check, but it's not a problem. King g2, the king will be very safe there. The queen is guarding c1, so you will not be able to deliver any checks there. But okay, I mean, that was found in home analysis. In the game, Capablanca played rook to f5, and here he says Lasker has some chances. Lasker doesn't like queen captures on e3, where you can just trade down into this endgame where you're down the exchange, but still you're up 2 pawns, so... But Lasker doesn't like his chances here. Instead, he plays h5, and now we have queen to d8 check by Capablanca. We have some repetition here. King g7, queen g5 check, king to f8, queen to d8 check, king to g7, and queen to g5 check. We have king to f8. Not really sure if this was already a threefold repetition. I'm not sure if threefold repetition existed back then. You probably just repeated moves, and then you nodded your head and the players agreed to a draw. But I don't think if it was a specific rule. I don't know when this rule became official of a threefold repetition. I read somewhere that before it wasn't so much of a threefold repetition as it is today, where the position is just repeated 3 times. I think back then, when the rule was first introduced, it would have to be the repetition of moves, such as in this case, repeating queen here, but not, for example, if you repeated a position several times and then play something else, and then the position again repeated itself. I don't think it was the case back then, but if any of you have some, nice resource where we can brush up our vast knowledge on this. You know, feel free to share in the comments. But okay, what do you play here? Here, Capablanca played b3, which is not the most precise way. The best idea was queen to f4, where capturing an a2 is really not an issue here. If you capture an a2, then you get queen to d6 check, and now black is lost. If you go somewhere here, then rook g5 is deadly. If you go here, then you get rook to d5 with the threat of checkmate, so you can't really prevent mate. Any check will be met with just rook to d1 if queen delivers check, and if you try f6, then you're just getting mated. Queen e6 check, king to f8, and now you can play whatever. Let's say rook d8 check picks up the queen, so even that is enough. But okay, after king f8, Capablanca played b3. He didn't find the queen f4 move, which also defends the a2 pawn indirectly. But now queen d6 by Lasker. Lasker now wants queen to g3. Capablanca, of course, denies it. We have queen to f4, blocks Lasker's queen, and now queen to d1 check. We have queen to f1, and now queen back to d7. Again, saying I'm defending the pawn here. You can't really move your queen a lot as the rook is also under attack. But Capablanca now wins the h5 pawn. Okay, Lasker wins the e3 pawn. A nice trade-off. And now queen to f3, pressuring the knight, and there aren't all that many squares for the knight. The queen and rook guard this square, the queen and rook guard this square, the c4 pawn guards this square. You don't really want to go back with the knight king, or in black's case forward, so queen to d4, just defending the knight and threatening some nasty discoveries. Here Capablanca played queen to a8 check with king to e7, and now you don't want to capture here. If you capture, then just king e6, and you don't really have any good checks. Rook h6 check, you get f6, and you're done with checks. Now it's black's turn to do some nasty discoveries. So Capablanca goes queen to b7 check, and now what do you play here? Here you have to play king to d6, and now white will just have to settle for a draw after a repetition of moves here. Queen b8 check, queen b7 check, or if you try rook h6 check, you're gonna get f6. And after queen b8 check, king e6, and there are no good ways to continue this. If you try something from behind, queen f5, king f5, and again, you don't have two moves. Any move that's not a check, black will respond with a deadly discovery, and then it's black who's on the attack. So this is what Lasker had in mind when he thought about this. And remember, after queen b7 check, this is Capablanca's 45th move, and Lasker now has to make his 45th move to reach the fourth time control. So they already finished their 3 sets of 15 moves per hour, so Lasker has to make one more move. And here Lasker played king to f8. Here the quote above the board says, "I had a quarter of an hour to think, but was absolutely incapable of doing so." This is what Lasker says about this position. So he had 15 more minutes, but he didn't really spend them wisely. He played king to f8, but king to f8 is actually a blunder that loses the game for Lasker. Unfortunately for Lasker, who really played a stunning game here, a beautiful exchange sacrifice, and really so much attacking potential. But this doesn't work. Lasker didn't use his 15 minutes, but you are welcome to use a few seconds, pause the video, and try to find the winning idea for Capablanca here. I'll give you a couple of seconds. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, you have just defeated Emanuel Lasker for the first time in your life. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the move is queen to b8 check, not queen to c8 or queen to a8. It seems similar, but it's really not. I'm going to explain. Queen to b8 check wins the game. This is what Capablanca played, and this is where Emanuel Lasker resigned the game for the first time against Jose Raul Capablanca, and Capablanca got his first victory over Dr. Emanuel Lasker. He resigned because here, whatever you play loses. If you try king to g7, then it's just queen to h8 check, king to g6, and you don't even have to capture the queen, just queen to h8 is mate. The king has nowhere to go. The problem is, well, it's not actually a problem. The beauty of the position is what happens after king to e7. The point is why I said you can't play queen to c8 check or queen to a8 check, because you have to keep an eye on the e5 square. Now you get rook to e5 check. This resource would not be available to you if you tried queen to c8 or queen to a8 check. And now what do you play here? If king to f6, then it's not a problem. Just queen to h8 check, king to g6, and now rook to g5 check. A nice sacrifice of the rook. After the king captures, you just eliminate the queen, and now it's game over. And on the other hand, after rook e5 check, if you don't go to f6, if you go king to d7, It's also not possible. Queen captures on a7, king to d6, and now queen to e7 check, king to c6, and now queen to f6 check. You get the same thing. If you move the king anywhere, for example, king here, just rook check picks up the queen here, and if you block with the queen, then the problem is that the knight on e3 is no longer defended. It just captures, and not that, sorry, not that. Rook captures on e3, and you get what I think Jan Gustafsson often mentions, that his favorite endgames are the ones where he has a rook and his opponent doesn't. So here we have one such endgame, of course, completely winning for white. But yeah, Lasker, of course, saw this, and after Capablanca played queen to b8 check, Lasker just resigned, which is really a terrible thing. I mean, Lasker, this is the 5th game of the match. Lasker really played the previous 4 games brilliantly, and here he played brilliantly, like he was twice as young as Capablanca, not older than him. I mean, really such a shame to ruin a game like this. But time control plus, probably he was tired. He couldn't have been too tired, as the game was adjourned and then continued. But who knows? We're gonna continue this match and see what happens and what Lasker had to say about this game, some other games, and the match in general. So that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Patrick Pogoda, James Chambers, Doug McNabb, Jesus David Badillo Herrera, and Donald Pettengill for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing the Capablanca saga, checking up on your suggestions, and continuing what we are currently doing. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.